Hey, leaders and go-getters. If you're here, you're all about growth, pushing boundaries, stepping up, and making an impact. But when it comes to your career, are you leading the game or just playing along? Whether you're chasing a promotion, switching careers, or just want to stand out, it all starts with one thing: your executive summary. And guess what? We've got the Ultimate Executive Summary e-playbook, and it's 100% free. This step-by-step guide will take you from a blank page to a bold, standout executive summary that grabs attention and gets results. It's time to stop blending in and start owning your career story. Download your free copy now at leadthegame.org/free resources. And while you're there, check out 3 more powerful tools to help you take control of your career. Don't let your resume ride the bench. Get in the game. Head to leadthegame.org/free resources and grab your free e-playbook today. Now back to the show.
Welcome to a special edition of What's on Your Bookshelf with your host, Denise Russo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's another episode of What's on Your Bookshelf. My name is Denise Russo. This is a special edition series. I'm so excited to be back again with my friend, Dr. J.D. Pincus. And J.D. is the author of The Emotionally Agile Brain, which is about mastering the 12 emotional needs that drive us. Last time we were together, we did an overview or an intro of how this wonderful book is laid out and about the company Agile Brain. And today now, JD, we're going to get right into the first of 5 parts of the book and of what you have written here that's called The Motives of the Self. And so, first of all, thanks for being here with me.
Oh, my pleasure, as always. Always thrilled to be here with you, Denise.
Awesome. Well, JD, selfishly, I suppose, I am very honored that you take the time to be able to share this great body of work with us and all of the great work that's being done at Agile Brain. And so just a reminder to the listeners, this book is so extraordinarily comprehensive. We mentioned last time that the bibliography itself is pages and pages long, where you could take even deeper dives into the content. And then in Agile Brain, there's also opportunities for people to become certified as coaches and debriefers of the Agile Brain assessment. So there's more information that you can access directly on the website. So before we jump into this part 1 on self, JD, is there anything else that I've neglected to share that we might want to drive the listeners to for Agile Brain?
I think you hit the major points. We do a monthly forum. It's the first Wednesday of each month. So for people who are just kind of getting into it and kind of curious about it, that's a great way to kind of join us. It's free, obviously. We have a lot of coaches from around the world who join. And basically just, we do some presenting, we do some interviews. Denise has graciously been interviewed on it. And it's just a great sort of introduction to see what this is all about. So.
Okay.
I'll just add that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to start at this 20,000 foot view of this part 1, which is all about the self. And so when we think about the self in this chapter in the book, JD, you've separated into 3 main areas: safety, authenticity, and potential. Can you help our listeners understand this about emotions and the power of self-actualization?
Sure. So the reason that they're arranged the way they are as sort of, foundational, experiential, and aspirational is that there's sort of 3 levels of development. It begins with the need for safety, psychological safety. The concept there is pretty straightforward. You need to feel psychologically safe. That is, you will not be threatened or somehow, humiliated or attacked if you, to express who you truly are. If you feel psychologically safe, you can express who you truly are as a person. Once you get to that point and you're really being who you are authentically, that's really your first opportunity to become who you can be, your sort of best self, your highest self, your sort of fullest articulation of yourself. It's kind of like if you were a writer and you were trying to sound like someone else. I'm like trying to write in the style of Stephen King or my professor or my boss or someone else. I will never achieve self-actualization as a writer. You have to speak in your own voice. And the sooner you get started on that in life, the better it is, because you'll be able to get there in your voice and be able to sort of master it and explore what's possible. So without authenticity, there's no self-actualization. We call potential in the book. And without safety, there's no authenticity. You can't really be yourself. So that's why we put them that way, as sort of a ladder.
When we talked last week, we had some really interesting history about you prior to becoming a doctor. And so just recently, there's been the passing of an icon in the music business, Ozzy Osbourne. And I saw your post recently on LinkedIn about that and your affinity for Black Sabbath and some of that type of music. And so I'm curious, when you think about this chapter on self and you're talking about being your authentic, true self, but maybe as starting out as a musician, were you emulating or having something in regards to looking at the authenticity of how could you be your own self, but looking at people you looked up to, whether it's somebody at work that you look up to, somebody in the entertainment business or celebrity business or government business that you look up to. And then how do you take that and drive your potential?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because if you just kind of naively listen to what we were saying and you think, I need to be my authentic self right now, and I need to speak in my own voice and self-actualize right now, but I'm just starting out, that doesn't work. Everyone needs to kind of go through that apprenticeship. You have to learn how the thing is done. So, I was a musician, but I was not, technically very skilled. I was pretty good. I was okay. I remember the guy we opened for said I was the best guitarist he had encountered since Cheetah Chrome of the Dead Boys, which was a high honor. But the truth is, probably Cheetah himself is not the greatest musician, but you need to kind of be humble when you start out. You need to learn your professors, the great writers, like your boss's style. You have to learn those things, and then through practice, then you become comfortable and conversant in multiple styles, and that's really your style doesn't just come out of thin air. It's really it's built on the experience you have with multiple styles. You sort of draw the things together from those that kind of create your style. So I don't think this is not something that I advise people, become self-actualized today, say that to a 20-year-old. That just, it doesn't make any sense. Maslow, when he talked about self-actualization, every example he has, basically people had to get to maturity and adulthood before they really could be self-actualized. So it's a goal. And most people will never get there, frankly. Maslow thought 3% would get there. I think we can do better than that. But the concept is you need to kind of go through that apprenticeship and practice and practice and practice, and eventually you'll get there.
So as you start to learn more about yourself, then what do you think about the idea that if you have this dream, maybe in your younger years, you wanted to be a musician. I also wanted to be a musician. I wanted to produce the halftime show of the Super Bowl. It never came to be, but doesn't mean it never will. It just hasn't maybe yet. But I'm curious when you're thinking about, as you're learning about that and your authentic self and the potential maybe you have for something like that, what happens when that dream shifts or changes? And is that okay? When you were talking in the book a little bit about relentless risk taking and at what time and at what point is it okay that your dreams maybe don't become self-actualized?
Yeah, I think, also the definition of what self-actualization is or could be can also shift, when it comes into contact with, the harsh realities of life, that sometimes you need to sort of, it's not really settling, but you need to sort of get comfortable with sort of where you are. And I think that's part of it. It's like, when Maslow talks about self-actualization, it's not like everybody there is the most incredibly successful version. It's really more of an attitude. It's really about being comfortable with who you are, knowing who you are, being sort of, unafraid to really be yourself and to speak in your own voice and to, really not doubt yourself is kind of, it's almost like the opposite of imposter syndrome, right? It's like, imposter syndrome is all about not really being confident in who you are, thinking that you're sort of playing a part, you're playing a role, and it's not really genuine. I feel like self-actualization is the polar opposite of that. It's when you're sort of completely comfortable with who you know who you are, and you are speaking in your own voice. And Maslow talks about the sort of, an almost arrogance of mindset or expertise in self-actualized people, that it's kind of like there's no question in their minds, that they are who they are. So they're not going to hesitate to speak or act. So that can imply some risk, but it doesn't have to. You can still, just live a normal life and have that attitude. And certainly, I feel like I know people who, they're not household names, but they live in that way. Like they absolutely know who they are. I consider them to be self-actualized.
Gotcha. Well, it sounds like what you're describing is the most holistic, well-rounded, healthy way of being. And if that's what we're all striving for, you talked about in this first part of the chapter about the 4 domains of well-being. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about why it's those 4 with physical, mental, financial, and social?
Sure. And I feel like the reason that there are multiple definitions. If you Google, definition of well-being, you will find, multiple definitions out there. These are the 4 that are the most common. So it's physical, it's mental, financial, and social. They do kind of map on to our 4 domains, but not perfectly. So the easiest one is social. So social, we have social, they have social, right? Financial is a weird one because it implies a Western capitalist mindset, right? That you own your own things, you have your own money, you have a job that pays you. There are many cultures around the world, especially historically, that did not have that. There was a communal ownership of things, tribal ownership of things, and you did that concept of financial would have been completely foreign to them. But in every society, wealth is not completely evenly distributed. Some people, through status or whatever, end up with more or better stuff. So to the extent that we're talking about stuff, it's material. So it's the analog of the material domain, right? It's objects, tools, it's resources, that sort of thing. So financial to me is material. Social, financial is material. Physical and mental is a weird one to me also, because it's sort of trying to reify this concept that there's a mind-body dualism, right? That there's your mental self and then there's your physical self. We know from tons of research that you cannot really separate those things. How you're feeling is in a large part driven by how you're doing physically. Our emotions are a kind of continuous readout of how we're feeling and how we're doing. Are we feeling good? Are we feeling tired? Are we feeling sick? Are we feeling hungry? Like those are continuous readouts that go into our mind and determine our thoughts, and they shape our thoughts, right? So I don't really believe in those as separate categories. So to me, I collapse those 2 as the domain of the self. So it's your physical being, your mental being, integrated into the self. That leaves one more that's missing. And I think it's intentionally missing from all of these models. It's intentionally missing from, like, for instance, the CDC's definition, and that's the spiritual. They don't talk about the spiritual. They just sort of pretend it doesn't exist. And I find that particularly maybe shocking because of just the enormous volume of research that's shown that people who are more spiritually evolved and people who have a more active spiritual life are actually in better physical and mental health than people who aren't. And it's not like it's a one-off. It's not like it's a fluke. It's been repeated over and over and over again. And I feel like it's basically reflecting a kind of academic historical discomfort with acknowledging that because of fears of we're talking about religion or whatever. We're not. We're talking about something that's much bigger than that. And when I define the spiritual domain, I define it as anything you can't see. It's concepts, ideals, principles, ethics, values. It's a higher purpose. It's not as limited as religion. So I just found it interesting too that the groups out there that have no trouble talking about spirituality as one of the pillars of well-being are the people who put their lives at risk. So, Edwards Air Force Base has a site where they begin with spiritual well-being. People who are basically willing to sacrifice their lives for their country, community, etc., didn't have any qualms about that. Putting that right up front, that sort of duty to country and duty to your fellow man was number one, even though those are things you can't see, right? So just interesting. So I think I listed those out just simply because they're the most commonly cited ones, but I have a critique of them, which is I think they really should be our 4 domains.
I love that. I love how you articulated the piece between the physical and the mental, because we know lots of research shows that if you have stress, it can manifest in disease and even ultimately death. And so I also like how you describe the spiritual part. As you know, I'm a person of faith. I know you're a person of faith. And I think there are several hundred citations in the Bible. And it doesn't mean that if you're listening that you are a person of faith or a person that is of the same faith as me or JD. Maybe you just have a spiritual sense about whatever that higher power is in your life. But we know from the Bible, there are hundreds of references that say, do not be anxious. Do not be afraid. And these messages come from messengers. I guess that's why they're called messages in hindsight of saying that sentence. But these messengers came with that message that this is the way for you to have balance and stability and clarity of thought, clarity in your emotional state, I suppose. And you go into the next part of this talking about how important it is to have psychological safety. And I don't want to say the name of the school unless you're okay with it, but you were having a discussion, we talked about it off mic, where a colleague or an associate of yours was talking about how high psychological safety, stress, and burnout is for college-age students at epidemic, maybe rates.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, it's funny. It's like that's actually, we weren't sure exactly where this model of ours and our technique was going to take us. And the market basically spoke and told us that it was student well-being because there's a crisis going on and there's people who are responsible for taking care of those students. It's not a idle concern. It's not a sort of sideline. Like they have to make sure their students are safe. It's not just important for, the ethical reasons. It's also important financially for them. Like you cannot have people attempting suicide or worse, at your school and expect the same volume of applications to come. People find out about these things. They get reputations. MIT for years, of course, they've got no trouble getting applications, but they were known as a place that was sort of, depressive and anxiety producing. And so no mid-sized college, wants to have that reputation. So there's a real problem. They need to do something about it. So this particular case, the guy told me that they had doubled their commitment to financially to student well-being, and that wasn't enough. They're actually shifting people to telehealth because they simply don't have the resources, even though they've doubled the staff, doubled the size of the square footage associated with it, doubled the funding, and it's still not enough. So student well-being is a very high priority. We've made this available to coaches, therapists, people in the medical profession, into HR and organizational development. But the real traction we're getting is with student well-being because there's such a crying need for it right now.
So if we think about this from the terms of if you don't feel safe and you don't have that sense of balance in your well-being, that potentially leads into fear, perhaps. And those things, I wonder if sometimes fear is not real. Like there's a song out by Zach Williams, who's a singer, and it's called Fear is a Liar. And is it true of this thing that you're afraid of? And there's like a book, I can't remember what the beginning of the book is. I think it's Start, but it's a John Acuff book, and the subtitle is Punch Fear in the Face.
Yeah.
And then there's another book that we're doing right now on what's on your bookshelf on our regular series that's called Un-F Yourself. It's basically untangling the mess in your mind.
Yeah.
That book is written by Gary John Bishop, who's kind of a no holds barred, doesn't bite his tongue on the way he talks. There's another great book. Of course, this is a podcast called What's on Your Bookshelf. So of course we have books.
Sure.
There's another book that was written by Dr. Caroline Leaf, who is a psychologist, and it's about your mental mess, and it's about also looking at those things that are fears, or is there truth in those fears? And so when you talk about this in the book, you mentioned an example of potentially, is it possible to live with no fear?
It is. And it's a very interesting case that I call out. It was one from Antonio Damasio's writing. This person that they give her the acronym SM. She had Urbach-Wiethe disease, which basically calcifies different parts of your brain. So it's a pretty tragic thing, and it basically knocks them out of functioning. In her case, it happened to take aim at the two amygdalae, which are sort of midbrain structures, which really are essential to feeling fear. You cannot feel fear without them. So what happened was these things began to calcify, and she discovered that she was no longer afraid of anything. And that sounds like a great thing, right? You're just completely fearless. It turns out, and there's another book, maybe for your bookshelf, called The Gift of Fear, which talks about the importance of fear as a piece of information which tells you, who to trust and who not to trust, which situations you should be avoiding. It's that sort of, sense you get, the sort of, tingling in your spine of like, I need to cross the street now. There's something going on ahead of me that's not safe. I think there's somebody who's following me. I think, this person who's trying to call out to me, like they're up to no good. She didn't have any of that. So this unfortunate person has been beaten up multiple times. She's been robbed, had knives and guns pulled on her, because she will walk through a park at night without a second thought, fearlessly. And that someone will call out to her, and she will, without that gift of fear, will just walk right over to them, and then that person, will rob her, or that kind of thing. And then she doesn't learn from it. And there's a lot of experiments that have been done in rodents that basically show this. They'll basically do this kind of ablation before fear conditioning, and they find that they're not able to learn fear. Even when something, this thing is going to shock you, they can't learn it. They will never make that association. Then they find, if they do the procedure after they learn fear conditioning, they still can't respond to it, because you need to feel that fear. It's not just a matter of learning and making that association between fear and a particular environment or situation. You have to be able to call up that fear right now in the moment for it to have any effect. So the memory of fear isn't enough. So I think, that's a really good example of how, our emotions are there to help us survive, and even though some of them can be inconvenient, like fear, and anybody with a phobia would love to get rid of it completely. But the truth is, phobias aren't random. People don't have phobias of laptops and books. They have phobias around snakes, spiders, cliffs. They aren't randomly distributed. And the reason we have those phobias is because of evolutionary survival. That's those things kept us alive. So again, there's a lot to be thankful for from fear as a kind of a thing, a gift that we get.
If we think about, JD, the concept of fight or flight, for example, what's the natural state? Is fear built in the flight piece of it? And does that mean that we're not naturally wired to be fighters?
Actually, so fight and flight are intimately linked. So we don't fight unless we feel fear generally. It isn't like it's a separate process. So there's a classic animal study that they do called the pain attack reaction, where you put one animal next to another animal, and then you deliver a shock or something to one of the animals, and what they do invariably is just attack the other one. They've been hurt, something's happened to them that they don't like, and they leap out and aggress instantly against the other. that there's no logical reason why they should do that. But certainly think about, in humans, when people are, tired and hungry, they get hangry, right? And they begin to lash out, road rage, domestic abuse, whatever it is. It's very easy to kind of lower people's ability to control themselves by having some burden on them. Like when you're in pain, when you're overtired, when you're hungry and thirsty and need to find a bathroom, whatever it is, you're vulnerable then to sort of lashing out. And everyone has experienced that, with friends, family members, the general public. And so I think, fear and anger aren't not different things. They're sort of just different stages, like, so, someone gets insulted and then they become aggressive. They had to originally feel slighted, like there was something like they were kind of pushed back, there was a kind of a fear moment, someone put them down that then elicited this sort of aggressive response. But you can't really get aggression without that first, taking a hit, basically.
This is a really good segue into the authenticity part of this section, because I've heard this saying before, the hurt people hurt people. And you mentioned that in this rodent study, for example. I'm curious, if we're not going to have enough time to go into deep detail on this section, but I really encourage you as listeners to get the book and read deeper. And the one place I do want to take some focus on, JD, for reasons, because I've experienced this myself with certain people, is this authenticity versus narcissism. You mentioned about just now what happens when people have some experience that maybe they use as a protection in their life. Maybe it's something from their past or their childhood that maybe then manifests itself into not being your authentic self, or you have a mask, or you hurt people because of something like narcissism.
Yeah, exactly. So the concept that's used a lot now is the sort of dark triad of, like grandiose narcissism or any kind of narcissism, and psychopathic tendencies, sort of really only caring about yourself and no one else. And what's the third layer of the triangle? It's it's escaping me. But in any case, or I think it's dogmatism. But the concept is that if you feel bad about yourself, you can just sort of withdraw, and there's people who do that. Or you can sort of come up with a coping mechanism to sort of try to make yourself feel better about it, and to try to, impress other people that you are a confident person and you shouldn't be messed with by being very super aggressive. So, and we certainly see a lot of this out in the world. People who, it's never enough, whether they're a billionaire or in some other field, there's no way of satisfying what's really missing inside them. So there always needs to be more. And there's the grandiose narcissist will be somebody who, can, own buildings and planes and put their name on things and everything else. And will never be satisfied with it. There's the vulnerable narcissist, which is really someone with very weak self-esteem who wants to, get through life by making people afraid of upsetting them, because they're going to overreact. So I think, narcissism has a big connection to authenticity. If you are really confident in who you are, who you are, you're not trying to fill some void through, material things or flashy and, flash in the pan kinds of exhibits. You're much more likely to be a happy, healthy person. You're much more likely to self-actualize. If you're kind of stuck in that narcissistic space, it's because you're constantly trying to prove something to yourself, and others. But it's inauthentic. It can't be authentic because it's not based on anything real.
So if we talk about, if you're somebody who has NPD or knows somebody with that narcissistic personality disorder, maybe you have been diagnosed or haven't, or you know somebody who has or hasn't, is this something, JD, that is tied to the chemicals, I guess, in your brain? How is that tied to the emotions that are parts of agile brain? Because it seems to me that if the person has this sort of disorder and doesn't not know that they're not being cruel to someone, but they just don't care, kind of like the lady who couldn't feel fear, do these people not feel empathy or love in the truest sense of what that might mean in a reciprocal relationship with someone?
Yeah, I think in most cases they have the equipment. They have the signal that's being processed in their brain, but through repeated experience over and over again, kind of creating those grooves, those sort of superhighways in their brain, it gets sort of corrupted so that it doesn't feel good to them to connect with other people, to become vulnerable. They can't let themselves go there, because they are so sort of consumed by the need to kind of project a particular image, project strength and invulnerability, that they can never experience those emotions fully. It basically becomes this sort of circular loop where the love that they should feel for other people is somehow channeled back into sort of self puffery, and narcissism. Like, I must be the best. I am the best. Everyone knows I'm the best. And that it really does sort of stunt them emotionally. So I think the signals are all there. It's just, through lots and lots of really bad experiences and training and, upbringing, those wires kind of get crossed. And you never end up, those signals that should lead to empathy, vulnerability, sharing, caring, they just can't be expressed.
Mm. It seems like the opposite side of that is where you go next in talking about imposter syndrome. So if the narcissist is somebody that thinks they're so amazing and wants everybody to think they're amazing, and yet maybe they don't really think they're amazing, is this the same or different when we're talking about if the narcissist wants you to believe they're amazing, but they maybe subconsciously or innately know they're not amazing? With imposter syndrome, isn't this where you're not, you believe you're not amazing as opposed to you believe you are?
Right. I feel like, so what it's all about is it's kind of like if narcissism is all about kind of it's almost like psychotic state where you're like, you can't accept reality because of this core belief you have that you're the best. And it reminds me of a study that was done on, they call it the dark side of self-esteem. There's a big self-esteem movement in the United States, during like the Barney years, you are special, everyone is special. What they found was in this study that the people with the absolute highest self-esteem were people who were on very long-term prison sentences, who were gang members. They had the absolute highest self-esteem. And what they had, I wouldn't call normal self-esteem. I would call it narcissism, right? It's sort of a psychopathic narcissism where you believe that you are entitled to more and better stuff than everyone else just simply because you are you. I feel like imposter syndrome is like the watered down version of that. It's like it's the less psychotic version. It's the one where I feel a little bit badly about myself. I'm not really convinced of who I am, my authenticity, but I don't believe that entitles me to things, but I have to kind of get through life, and I've got to, give this presentation, and I've got to do this, thing, and I've got to have these experiences, but I don't really feel like I deserve it. Like, I feel like I'm not quite ready for it. I feel like I'm sort of pretending. I feel like that's the sort of watered down, not crazy version, and it's incredibly widespread. So it's really not even it's not in the DSM, it's not a clinical diagnosis, because I think something like the majority of people, suffer from it, and that is, it's become almost sort of a cultural thing, that. People aren't shy about saying they have imposter syndrome. In a way, it's a kind of a humility. It's saying, I know that I'm not the best at this, and it should then motivate you to want to learn more, to practice more, to do those things. At its worst, it's basically preventing you from making forward progress because you doubt yourself so much.
Mm-hmm. I heard the saying before in some leadership seminar that said, to know yourself, you have to grow yourself. And so as you're growing in business, and you get maybe that next job jump into a new role or a new title or a larger team or something like that, it shouldn't be expected that you already have it all figured out. You were given the opportunity to go into that role in order to grow and to show that you can add value. And so if you go from narcissism, you go to this idea of imposter syndrome, but now you pivot into what happens to people that get caught up in believing things that are just not true, having these coping strategies. We talked about this, goes into the third part of this section, which is the conspiracy theorists.
Right. Yes. And this is a favorite topic of mine because when I did this research, there were just a lot of conspiracy theories out there, and we thought it would be fun to sort of, measure how common it is that people would believe a whole host of things like, COVID isn't real. The COVID test is actually implanting a small device, so the government can track you, and a whole, the moon landing was faked. Like a whole down the line. The Earth is flat. You got the whole panoply. What became incredibly interesting was when we looked at the Agile Brain data against those items, and there was a really unmistakable pattern that people who had huge spikes in terms of prevention energy, sort of, I want to get rid of this bad feeling on the negative side of potential, sort of limitation. I'm feeling limited. I'm feeling like I can't get ahead. I can't grow. I can't, move forward. Those were the people who believed in conspiracy theories overwhelmingly. And it makes sense. It's basically an indicator of stress. It's saying, I am not doing well, and for some people that leads them not to say, so what can I do to change my circumstances? What can I do to better myself? What can I do to start over? Instead, they look for somebody else to blame. And this is not news to anybody. Scapegoating has been around for a very long time. But it hands you a very convenient excuse for why you're feeling miserable. So if everyone is lying to me and the system is stacked against me and everyone is out to get me, and there's other people who say that that's the truth, there's a greater likelihood I'm going to believe that if I feel really bad about myself and I feel like there's no way I'm getting ahead. So we have this cartoon in the chapter on potential of, these two movie theaters side by side. One is showing a movie called A Reassuring Lie, and the other one's showing a movie called A Convenient Truth. And there's nobody going to see an inconvenient truth. And there's a huge line of people waiting to buy tickets for A Reassuring Lie. And it was a great cartoon because it really does make that point that people do seek out confirmatory information. And that's unfortunately what's happening in our, in the politics of our age, is that people are kind of retreating into what's comfortable, will not challenge them at all, will not expose them to any ideas that they find uncomfortable. And it just creates echo chambers. So, yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because it does seem like that's what keeps government in business, or at least the people that are elected officials, because they count on one side believing one thing, another side believing the other thing, and never shall the two meet in the middle. And, and you talk about how if you have this idea that you want to follow the reassuring lie versus the inconvenient truth, and it be based on anxiety and stress and maybe even lacking these coping skills. You mentioned earlier that the fifth domain not mentioned is on the spiritual side. And in the end of this chapter, you do talk about the markers of actualization in the spiritual domain. How does that play in, like what you described earlier? You mentioned about how if you are somebody that has a stronger tendency that way, that you have maybe more groundedness. How does this piece in this chapter on potential make the most sense to end this chapter this way?
Yeah. So it's interesting that this was Maslow's sort of last contribution was just before he died, and unfortunately, when they show his pyramid of motivations, they kind of cap it at self-actualization. He believed there was a higher level called transcendence, which is the name of our chapter for purpose in the spiritual domain, because he saw that people who got to that very high level of self-actualization were much more likely to actually transcend the self. So self-actualization is sort of a stage of development where I'm going to become my best version of myself. I'm going to become all that I can be, right? But there is, once you've achieved that, there is a higher level, which is to go actually beyond the self and say, okay, I'm great and all, and I've mastered what I want to do, but it's not about me. It's actually about a higher purpose. It's about everyone. It's about, every living thing, about our planet, about our universe. And once you make that switch, you're no longer in the sort of self domain. You've now transcended over to the spiritual domain. So that tendency to kind of, be able to sort of view things cosmically, view things, objectively and outside of time and outside of relationships that are particular to you. He saw that as that sort of highest level of self-actualization, which I would argue is actually you're leaving self-actualization at that point and you're actually going somewhere else. And, one of the characteristics around that is he said there was sort of resolution of opposites, things that really confound a lot of people here about, should it be this thing or should it be that thing? And these choices, particularly in politics, that they tended not to see them as opposites. They tend to see them as just sort of different framings of the same problem and had different, really interesting, other dimensions coming in that can resolve those kinds of conflicts. So it's truly a higher kind of thinking, which, sadly is not as widespread as it might be. But it really is where solutions come from. It's sort of saying, forget the old jargon, the old politics, the old, arguments, and the old debates. Let's actually try to solve this problem in a way that's sustainable, So I think that's the sort of highest hope for the sort of potential, part of our model is to get to the point where you've become so confident in yourself and so masterful at what you do that you actually can forget about yourself and go to this next square.
I imagine to get outside of yourself, you have to be outside of yourself. So that implies being open-minded versus closed-minded. You talked a little bit about Carol Dweck and her work with growth mindset, even at the end of the chapter. We're going to get outside of ourselves next week, since we're out of time for today, and talk about the motives of the material world. Looking forward to having that discussion. When you get the book, friends, there at the end of this chapter, there's some really great coaching questions, or maybe reflection questions, journaling questions, just questions that will help you think deeper about where we are, even in just this early part of the book. So there, you'll find questions that say, do you feel that you're utilizing your talents and abilities to the fullest? And my question as a coach to my clients would be like, if you don't say yes, well, then what's missing for you? And let's try to get you one step ahead. There's a whole list here. I think there's at least 10 or a dozen questions, and you'll see that this book, again, is deeper than just the 400 pages that are in it. There are ways for you to grow in it. Our podcast is about living out loud the pages of the books that are on our bookshelves, going deeper. John Wooden, his father, taught him several principles in life, and one of them was to dive deeply into great books. And so that's what we're attempting to do here in the spirit of living out his legacy as well. JD, as always, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for teaching us even beyond the pages that you have supplied us with here. Before we go for today, is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I think, my takeaway on the domain of the self is that an important thing to realize about the self is that the self domain is actually a function of your interactions with all the other domains. So the self is its own thing, but the self also tends to be fed by what you do in the material domain, right? What you strive for in the material domain, what you do in the social domain, your relationships with other people, how you're viewed, that sort of thing, and what your relationship is with higher principles. Do you walk around with a set of values that you're aware of that guide your life? all those things go into sort of who you are. So that those things can bring you a sense of psychological safety. Those things go to kind of form your authentic self and the definition of who you are. And ultimately, they help you grow to become the sort of fullest version of yourself. So they are separate, but not separate. There's a lot of crosstalk in our model.
Understood. Well, this has been very enlightening and wonderful. Thank you for listening, friends. If you're finding value in this, not only get this book, but please share these episodes with others that can get value from it as well. My name is Denise Russo, and on behalf of my friend, Dr. J.D. Pincus, the author of The Emotionally Agile Brain, Mastering the 12 Emotional Needs That Drive Us, this has been another episode of What's on Your Bookshelf.